Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Andrew Otwell. I'm a user experience design lead here at LabKey, which means I help design Sample Manager. And then, like Hannah just said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we do that. But I wanted to start with sort of describing what that term user experience design means to us here at LabKey. We believe that more efficient, usable tools can accelerate innovation and reduce effort and errors. In particular, in environments like you all are working in, or like Alexandra and Ty just described in such good detail, complex regulated environments, where processes are often changing. These are tricky places to get usable and efficient tools to work well. But UX design, user experience design, is really the research and design work of organizing data, creating the visual presentation, the literal pixels on the screen that you interact with, and the arrangement of software elements, all with the goal of understanding and meeting users' needs. So how do we solve the puzzle of what you need to do turned into software that you can use easily and adopt easily in your lab? How do we get from here to there? And of course, that, as we've already heard, I think in such great detail this morning, that is not the job of one person or two people. It's me there on the left with Keegan Green, who's another UX designer at LabKey, Hannah, of course. Susan Hurt is our director of engineering on Sample Manager, and Lance, of course. All of us at LabKey have a role to play in what I think of as kind of the user experience that you have with our software. From the first days of it to upgrading or adopting new features. And there's really sort of another person that's kind of involved there that I want to kind of acknowledge, and that's really you guys, the users of Sample Manager, people like Alexandra or Ty, or any of you sort of listening today. I mean, you do play a role in helping us understand what we should build and how it should work in ways that continue to be as usable and intuitive and straightforward as possible for you. And your participation in that process, I think, again, as we've heard so much, is really critical to figure out how do we make decisions about what the software should do and how it should do it so that we're supporting your lab scenarios when we're choosing what to do. And sometimes when I tell people, oh, I'm a software designer, they say, oh, just make it simple and intuitive. Like, that's it. Sure, that's great. We totally agree at LabKey, 100%. These are our goals that we think about every single day. It would be completely inappropriate to think of LabKey products, or Sample Manager in particular, as needing to look like distracting or cool or pretty or animated or whatever. Our whole goal is to make sure that you're able to focus on your scientific data, your scientific processes, and not on the user interface or where a button is or what it would do. We want to minimize all of those things as much as possible. But of course, these two words, simple and intuitive, are really hard to get right, especially in domains like we've been talking about this morning. And here's how we sort of think of what those words mean and how we try to solve for these things every day. Simple, for us, it certainly does not mean simplifying the complexities of the domain. What it means is making the product as visually clear and uncluttered as possible, meaningfully organized and internally consistent. A button on one screen should be like a button on the other screen if it does something similar. We want to make sure that those things are rigorously consistent. Intuitive is really an interesting word because I'm so glad to hear both Ty and Alexandra use it to describe Sample Manager already this morning. But what it means is really that it's familiar and predictable. Something that's intuitive is something that you can approach and say, oh, I know how this works before I even use it. But it also means it's prioritizing relevant features and information, not irrelevant ones, and that it uses existing vocabulary and concepts that you already use in your lab, not new vocabulary or new concepts. And it builds on conventions that you've learned from other software. There's kind of a saying, I guess, in sort of product design that users will spend 90% of their time using other people's software. I think we probably all use Amazon or Netflix more than we use Sample Manager, really. But what that means is the things that we learn from all of those other sort of software experiences we bring to working using software in offices or labs. And we have to acknowledge all those kinds of conventions and understand where we can kind of make use of them. And of course, simple and intuitive really also means that it's focused on a purpose. your specific scientific goals and scenarios are, the purpose that we're here to solve for. And so each of these words that I've highlighted here are things we really need to understand. Like, what does it mean to have something be familiar and predictable to you as a lab scientist or as a researcher or as a lab manager? What is the existing in vocabulary and concepts that you already use that we need to adopt, that we need to understand how to deploy in the software to make it as approachable and intuitive as possible? And of course, what are your specific scenarios? Like, even in the cases we've heard this morning, like fairly different scenarios around the practice of managing samples in different kinds of labs. So it's really, it really is about how do we uncover and learn from you what these things are, not just sort of what feature is missing or what bug do we have to fix. Of course, those things also matter, but as we're thinking ahead, we think of and I actually want to pause and just again sort of acknowledge how great it was to hear this morning people talking about working with Lance and Hannah during the onboarding and migration period, because that also is part of the core of the user experience of our products, is getting you set up for success from the start. And again, I'm just really glad to hear the details that Alexandra and Ty both shared with us today. But we think, this is the diagram that Hannah showed before, and I want to touch on again because it really does drive sort of everything that we do here. Your regular use of Sample Manager in the lab, we hope that it's making your work more efficient, easier, more reliable, fewer errors, all that kind of thing. But of course, over time, your organization is going to grow, change, your processes will change as you scale. Alexandra's example was a really great one of that. And we need to understand where those changes are going. Where is your lab headed? Not just where are you today? How many samples do you have in storage today? Where might you be in a year? And how might that knowledge that we get drive the features that we decide to prioritize to make, the new tools or capabilities that we build into Sample Manager? So I just want to reinforce again, Hannah showed this diagram kind of first thing this morning, but it really is kind of at the core of what we do, is that your feedback and what we learn from you is really what produces Sample Manager in the end. So I'm going to give you one example of a project we worked on last year that I think really illustrates this well. This was work that Keegan Green, the other designer at LabKey, led. And we wanted to learn as much as we could about the user experience of importing, registering, and storing samples, which I'm pretty sure almost everybody on this call who's a Sample Manager user has done. So this is really the kind of backbone capability of the product, and the part that we felt was the most important to get the most right that we possibly could, and to make the most adaptable to the ways that our customers were working. And one of the things we actually wanted to know was, how are people getting samples into Sample Manager for the most part? Importing Excel files, registering samples manually, registering a lot of samples manually, registering them once in a while, one at a time. And of course, we found all kinds of answers because everyone's lab works differently. But we did sort of notice a couple of things. Everybody, I think often, samples arrive to you in some way, usually with some spreadsheets. This is, can be kind of a messy sort of starting set of data in a lot of cases. And it really looks very different for everybody. No two labs really have this sort of identical sort of start to this process. Those were imported into Sample Manager, and those became structured data. And then, of course, you can put those samples in storage locations. So really, this was a couple of distinct steps: register samples, then store them. And that worked well for many people. And I think it worked fine for almost everyone to kind of work in that structured way. But what we learned, the more we talked to and watched people register samples, import them, add to storage, we sat down with them and actually watched. We learned that a lot of labs need to think of this as kind of one step, register and store as kind of one step. And we had built it in a way that it wasn't quite like that. We really wanted to adjust that user experience to more closely match that mental model of thinking of registering and storing as kind of one activity. What that did not mean was throw everything out and change it and make it a totally different way. What it meant was a series of sort of careful evolutions and set of improvements to kind of approach that way of thinking in as careful a way as that we could, so that we could make that as undisruptive as possible. So one of the things that we did was in the process of letting you import new samples. So if you're uploading an Excel file with all of your sample data, you would use this importing samples process. We created, I'm going to turn on my little cursor here. Yep. We created the option that didn't exist before to create storage on the fly during sample import. So you can provide storage locations that if they don't yet exist in the system, they're just created for you, so that when you register a sample with a storage location, it's placed, it's given that storage location as one step. Now, in the product, this is a pretty small change, right? It's kind of like one other button. But the user experience of getting to that point of enabling that capability of offering this choice was a really significant amount of back-end technical work led by Susan and her team. And to ensure that those kind of changes, when they're made, are very seamless to you, totally reliable, don't get in the way, don't require you to change your data structures or anything like that. I was really glad, again, that Ty, I think you mentioned something kind of like this, where kind of the ability to sort of get through that data migration in a very short amount of time was because we put such a huge emphasis on the user experience of reliability, seamlessness, and again, kind of not forcing you to kind of change anything about your data in order to make use of new things. Or waiting for software to reboot, for your IT team to go reboot your old software. Like that's terrible to me. Like literally stopping your scientific work so that somebody can restart a server or something. We think of all that as like really core to the user experience, a reliable system that doesn't require rebooting, that lets you spend all of your time doing your scientific work. Like that's the user experience that we want to deliver. It's not just kind of fewer clicks or fewer steps, but it's less chance of work getting left incomplete. It's getting done sooner with the kind of administrative work of just putting your samples into inventory. And of course, this is not done. We're not stopping here. We want to continue to learn, especially as labs grow into larger and larger scales. Like, what else do we do to make importing and registering samples even more efficient or more sort of powerful? Another thing we did as part of this research project, or another thing we learned as part of this research project, was when creating samples manually, typing them in by hand as opposed to importing them from a spreadsheet, we also ran into this problem of needing to be able to create storage units that didn't yet exist. I have a new box. I never set it up in Sample Manager before, but here I am registering samples and I need to put them in this new box. It used to be that you'd have to stop what you're doing, go to a different part of Sample Manager, create that box, come back, and then you could use it. Sort of I think of it as like a side quest you had to go on to finish before you could do the real thing. So what we did was enable the possibility of letting you create a box on the fly here. This box number 2, which I'm giving a name 040314 received samples. It's a tube rack. Doing that on the fly while registering samples. Again, saving time, saving steps, preventing you from needing to navigate somewhere else in the product. Much faster, much more straightforward. And again, matching your mental model that we learned about, that this process is one step, not 2 discrete steps, if you need it to be. So now I'm going to ask for your help, because everything I just described, we really could only confidently prioritize and design for because we knew about how people worked in the lab, and because we knew that different labs had slightly different ways of working or needed to prioritize kind of this one-step approach versus the 2-step approach. Like we learned that because we were able to observe people like you working in your lab and talk to you about how the work went. So when we're done here today, I'm going to be reaching out to everyone at the conference to ask for your help and time in as accommodating a way as we possibly can make it. We would love to meet with you, not to, sort of hear about, a list of new features that you need or bugs or whatever, but to teach us about how you use Sample Manager and to teach us about how you need to manage samples in your lab. I think of this sometimes as like, I want to act like the new hire in your lab that you have to train one day. How are your processes done? What pieces of the old process need to be reflected in the new process? These are things that are absolutely invaluable to us in designing Sample Manager. Again, it tells us what to prioritize, what language to use in the product, what features to emphasize, or even what not to, where scale matters or where it doesn't. All of these things we can learn the best by having you show us how you use the product or other products in the process of managing samples in your lab. 45 minutes at most, I'm hoping to ask for. Whenever works for you, we're going to be as accommodating as we absolutely possibly can. I think if you give us 45 minutes, I'd be willing to promise that we can ultimately save you a lot more time than that in the future, based on what we designed. And I really want to emphasize that there's no preparation or anything you have to do. This is not we don't want to make this a burden at all. We want to sort of meet you wherever you are and whenever you're doing the work that you're doing. One person from your lab is plenty. We don't need your whole team. Again, think of it as like, how might you train a new person in the lab? That's the conversation that I would really like to have with you. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Hannah. Please enjoy the rest of the day. I'm happy to answer questions about design or products at LabKey if anybody has any.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And again, sort of put your questions in chat. I guess I'll ask one question, and just kind of curious on what's your most favorite thing that you've sort of worked on in Sample Manager that it kind of, yeah.
What stands out? I actually was really happy that Lance talked about Sample Finder in his presentation this morning. I think it's really amazing to be able to say, I need to find the DNA samples from donor 5 and 12 received in the last 14 days by either Hannah or Andrew that don't yet have quality assurance assay data for them yet. Which samples specifically are those, and where are they? And you can create that query like very easily. And if you wanted to sort of run that every Monday morning, you could save that report and look in every morning. What samples haven't gotten that assay data yet? And it's pretty straightforward to do. I think that kind of thing that kind of breaks out of the silos of samples or sources or data and lets you sort of see across all of it is really, really excellent.
Yeah, I agree. As a person that used to have to create those, that it's nice to imagine a world where it doesn't take hours. So awesome. Well, thank you so much. And feel free if folks have questions to continue to sort of put them in the chat or Q&A, and we can always bring Andrew back as well.